right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar brought to you by Codefresh Live. Today, we are presenting logging best practices in the CICD era. Our presenter today is Ariel Assaraf, co-founder and CEO of Coralogix. And today, he will show you how to transform your logs into a treasure trove of opportunities for improving your CICD process and anticipating operational problems before they happen. But first, a couple housekeeping notes before we get started. We encourage your questions throughout the session. However, please remember to enter them using the Q&A button on your Zoom toolbar. That way they don't get lost in the chat. I will be making some general announcements in the chat, and feel free to use that as well to communicate with everybody on the line. This session is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you by tomorrow from me, Taryn at Codefresh, so please look out for that recording. Lastly, please remember to reference codefresh.io/events for upcoming webinars, as we have fresh and informative webinars for you several times a month. And with that, I will hand it over to our presenter, Ariel, to kick off the presentation. Hi, Ariel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Taryn. So this presentation is actually about a new way of doing things in terms of CI/CD and logging, and how you combine them both to achieve, first of all, faster delivery, and second of all, being able to perform CI/CD without compromising your quality or stability. A bit about Coralogix. Coralogix is a machine learning platform for logs, basically allowing you to ship all your data to Coralogix, and besides searching, visualizing, and alerting, get automatic anomalies, both in general and also in the context of the versions that you deploy. So Coralogix integrates with any CI/CD tool, for instance, Codefresh, and allows you to get a benchmark on every deployment you do to your production. Working with over 1,200 customers worldwide, with offices in Tel Aviv, Mumbai, and New York. Currently stepping in closer and closer to companies working in a CI/CD model, because we figured out that one of the biggest pain points in production stability is changes. So this presentation is going to cover, first of all, proper logging, and then talk a little about how everything combines with your CI/CD your CI/CD process. Like Taryn mentioned, you guys are welcome to ask any question during the presentation. I'll answer everything as we finish the presentation and get to the Q&A part. It can be questions about logging in general, infrastructure, monitoring, CI/CD, and how they combine. So don't limit yourself to a specific area. We have a pretty packed agenda, but I think we can probably cover most of it real quick. Formats of logging and how to overcome legacy logs, which is a big problem with many companies we see. Log severity definition and standardization. A big issue for a lot of companies wanting to basically achieve a standard of how they define severity in their organization, because this is one of the key metadata fields within a log. A bit about logging best practices, some things that we've seen throughout those 1,200 customers that we're serving, and best practices that we've learned along the past 5 years ever since we started Coralogix. Alerting. Why do you need alerts on logs? There are so many alerting systems in your monitoring stack. Why do you need it for logs? How to do that properly? And our general approach towards push alerts, PagerDuty, Opsgenie, and so on. How do you use logs, proper logs, to basically enhance your CI/CD in itself? How do you do more deployments? How do you monitor your deployments? How do you understand how to troubleshoot your deployments, your automation tests? How can logs be a source for better CI/CD? How do you benchmark your versions? So when you do a lot of deployments, there are a lot of changes happening. You want to be on top of things and be able to understand whether a certain version broke something. Why are logs a very good source of custom matrix, and how can you use logs to transform them into business logic matrix? and a bit about Coralogix and its new approach towards logging. How do we do things differently and more proactive? And a bonus question, which is why are logs called logs? I'm not sure everyone asks themselves, but it's a pretty interesting story. So let's talk a bit about the format. Why is JSON the format that is currently taking over basically any modern company writing its logs? So first of all, JSON format is very easy to filter and group. The data is tagged by types, and it's basically the most labeled data that you can get. So whenever you want to slice data, it's very easy to combine a query or to combine a filter based on two fields and then create, for instance, ranges on numeric parameters labeled by other keys that are textual. It's very easy to visualize, specifically, you know, with Kibana Grafana giving you visual builders that take those keys and allow you to really bring life into your log data, into your textual log data. It's very easily read. You can build your layouts based on what you care about, and then basically get a very set view for each and every user. So now we can write logs that contain all the metadata that we can care about. And then whoever uses these logs can basically build his own layout for his own usage. And then it's supported by most coding languages and loggers. So it's very easy today to produce JSON formatted logs with any logger, any standard logger. And it's also very easy to transform data to JSON format using regular expressions or grok filters and logstash and so on. So even if you have legacy data, it's quite easy to move it to JSON and enjoy the benefits that you get with that. Just a quick example on why is JSON the right format. If I have two logs, then it's going to be very complicated to do, and obviously you have way more than two logs, to have a query that is searching based on text solely and then only retrieve the data that you care about. Because if I search 29, I'm going to get both Ariel and Lior because those numbers appear. This is a very naive example, but I guess it gives you a sense of what we like. Because now we query 29 and we got both logs, rather than JSON where you basically specify what I need is age column 29. And then you only get people that are 29 years old, or maybe you want to have ranges. You say age 25 to 35, and then only get the relevant people. So JSON format gives you an easier way to analyze data, and it's very easy to generate. Now, this is an important part that I see with many companies. So now we've produced our log. We have it set as keys and values, and one of the most important keys is your log severity. And log severity has been here forever. People have written severities for logs since the first logs were written, I don't know, 40, 50 years ago. But it was never standardized in terms of how do I define the proper severity so that anyone reading this log understands what I meant or understand how important this output is. And then there are a few guidelines with examples that I've written here that I'd like to cover. Debug and verbose, basically logs that are describing something that's happening in the background. You typically don't really need them. You only need them with something that is when you have a crisis or an issue that requires a very thorough drill down all the way to things that happen in the background, things that didn't happen the way you expected them to. So they give you further context of what's happening in your system. So a good example of that would be number of messages in user creation group and user creation queue is 3,482. So now this will generate a debug log every few seconds with the number of messages in the creation queue. And then only if I have an issue that requires me to go back and debug, I can look at this log and understand maybe the number of messages was too high, or maybe we only see it increasing without decreasing. But that's really for tuning performance or other tough issues that you need to debug. Info is usually describing, when properly used, describes transactions that were completed. User sign up completed, money transaction happened, webhook sent to user, data written to Kafka. So you really want to have a full process transaction completed that you display as an info log. Warning logs, generally, if properly used, describe things that happen that are unplanned, that you didn't expect them to happen in a certain way, but are not not affecting your production, or not what you actually stop and fix. So a good example here would be received illegal character for username James, and I'm ignoring that character. So you still want to write them. You still want to have them as warnings, because, for instance, if we get a bunch of these, if we get 1 million of these every day, we'd probably want to enforce the alphanumeric usernames in our UI, for instance. And if we get billions of them, it might actually affect the stability of the system, or create a bad user experience. Errors are the opposite of info logs. They're failed transaction, failed to execute a query for a certain user, failed to transfer money for a certain user, failed to send webhook, and so on and so forth. So these are things that you want to monitor, you want to track, you want to be alerted if they happen more than the usual, or more than you expect them to happen. But typically, you don't stop your work and do, leave everything and start handling these errors. So errors are describing broken transactions that may occur occasionally. You want to have them in your backlog. You want them very clearly distinct from the rest of the data. And you want to monitor them to understand if you have trends or unexpected behaviors from them. Critical and fatal logs are often used too easily. They're usually logs that immediately should trigger an alert. They should be addressed immediately. They're super interesting, and you need to take everything off your table and give attention to them. So for instance, no connection to DB, failed to register user, is very different than failed to register user. If you have a fatal log there, you now understand that no one is going to be able to register. You should stop everything and fix that. So what we typically see with companies is that about 6% on average, and we're talking over a few tens of terabytes a day, 3% are high severity. These, in proper logged companies, these critical and fatal logs usually don't take over 0.01% of the data. So if you have more of them, you might want to check if you're being a little too easy on them, and you should transfer more critical and fatal logs towards the error severity. So now that we have our data as JSON and it's labeled correctly with the right severity, let's talk a little about the best practices that you can take today to improve your logging and your observability into your system throughout logs. So first thing is log the communication between components. One thing that is very typical that we're seeing with many customers is that they log everything internally happening, and then each service basically writes its own logs. And the only log that you see that is related between two services is the request itself. Even that is many times not happening. What you actually want to do, you want to describe everything that is happening before you send a message to another service. You want to describe the message in full, and then you want to describe the reception of that message in the other service and what it's done with that. So for instance, if we in Coralogix have a real-time categorization service, we describe that it pulled a message from Kafka at a certain format and a certain payload in that message. Then we describe the internal process, and then we say, this is the message that I written back, and this is the response that I got. So now basically, if something goes wrong, it's very easy to troubleshoot and go all the way, whether it's the payload that was broken, latency in writing, bad response from Kafka, and so on. So log the communication between your components and microservices, not just internally. log communication with external APIs. That's a big issue that a lot of companies have. And we constantly get questioned about this from our customers. A lot of the times you're relying on many external services, whether it's payments or email sending services, like SendGrid or machine learning APIs. And so you want to understand exactly how did you communicate with them, so because you have a blind spot over there. So if the first bullet here talked about two components that you own and only log within themselves, and then you need to log the communication, this is even more critical because you only have your side of the log. The rest is happening on another service that you're blind to. And just for instance, to give you an example, Coralogix sends emails, for instance, to its users. We use SendGrid to do that. If a critical alert email did not arrive, it's a big issue. And many times you want to log that so that if someone complains or if an important message wasn't sent, I have the ability to understand exactly what happened and make sure that I give the customer a proper answer to this question. So we log everything up until the point where we send the message to SendGrid, including the payload itself and the response from SendGrid. That way, whenever someone says, I didn't get an email alert, we can actually check and see exactly what happened inside Coralogix, see that we sent out that webhook in the proper format to SendGrid, and then go to SendGrid and see the responses that their API received from our user's email server. So that way, you get a very comprehensive view of what's happening both in your system and with external APIs. Another important thing is to add valuable metadata. So we briefly spoke about this in the JSON format preference that we have. Different users use your logs, and as your organization scales, you're going to have many different shareholders needing these logs to do their day-to-day job, whether it's support engineers or QA engineers or developers, obviously DevOps, SRE. BI teams a lot of the times actually require logs because they're a very good source of truth to understand what's happening in the business. And then if 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when I studied to code, everyone we're talking about how short logs should be, and you should be very concise because logs take bandwidth and so on. These days, with the bandwidth and the compute that you have and the easier scale, just write good proper logs. Just write the log that contains all the metadata that you can think of, so that people reading this log will have a wider context. And more than that, that everyone in your organization, different stakeholders, can actually find the way for them to visualize that data, to build the layout that fits their department, that fits their needs. So such metadata should be, for instance, customer ID or location is very important data many times. There are tools that enrich the data so that you have it enriched even if you have just the IP. You probably want to add a service name, version. You want to add the environment name. You want to add sometimes some matrix around the log. For instance, if it's an error, you may want to print even the CPU and memory. You should have both systems, but sometimes it's just easier to see in one at a glance. And then once you have that data, if you use the right system, you can use that data to customize whatever view you need or your users need. Remember that you're not the only one reading these logs. A common issue that we see with many companies, just unreadable logs, just a bunch of printing that doesn't mean anything to anyone. Many times it's written by developers that are thinking that they're going to be the only one maintaining that code. But as the companies scale, they find themselves having to give other people the option to change their code or to take another on-call rotation in which people that are not familiar with that code, with that log, are going to need to face it sometimes in the middle of the crisis and understand what happened there. So logs like, if you see this called John, and we've seen these type of logs, are not the right way to go. You want to describe why is this log printed. And again, if you add the right metadata to it, people can actually make use of it. I touched this point in the valuable metadata. Combine textual and matrix fields within your log output. So you want to have the text saying fail to do something. For instance, if we're looking at an error log, combined with some metadata fields that give me a full picture of the customer, location, the cluster, the service name, and so on. You also want to have a few matrix snapshots of CPU, memory, thread pool, and so on, so that even if I don't go ahead and look at the matrix system, I can actually look directly at the log and understand, CPU was 100, came together with latency, user failed to sign in. Makes sense. Now let's go drill into the performance data. So these are just 5 top best practices that we've seen to log communication between components, with external APIs, add the right metadata so that other people in your organization in different departments can use it. Remember, you're not the only one reading it, and add text and matrix fields into your log whenever it's necessary, whenever that log is an important one. A bit about alerts. Coralogix basically is a strong believer in the need for log alerts. We see many companies using logs as a post-mortem tool. So they rely on getting alerts from their APM or, Prometheus, Grafana, any other matrix alerting systems. And then you need to take into account that logs are a leading indicator of issues. APM is lagging behind logs in how fast it can detect issues, and matrix are a really lagging indicator. If we look at matrix for infrastructure, or even business logic matrix, they only present the outcome of problematic code. They only present the outcome of bad performance, which is something that you see in your business logic, or an increase in the resources that you're requiring with your app, like CPU, memory, and so on. And then logs, being the first encounter of your code with reality, in essence, are giving you a very easy way to figure out things before they even reflect in your performance or felt by your users. So this is why we like logging alerts. The way to properly define them is to make alerts very, very accurate. So we see many customers creating alerts that are general, like let me know whenever there's an error, or whenever there are more than 1,000 errors in 10 minutes, I want to receive an alert. That's great. That tells you that something went wrong. But this is a very matrix way of thinking of logs. Logs have so much more context, so much more information in them. So if you can create specific alerts that tell you user failed to purchase, and the condition for that alert would be user failed to purchase and purchase size over $100 and environment production and country US. Now you can get an alert that tells you exactly what happened, which is something that you shouldn't be able to get that easily and quickly from any other tool rather than logs. So what we say is define very, very specific alerts, and prepare them per service, and then have those alerts streaming into very specific Slack channels, if Slack is your way of managing data, or email, whatever. But have them streaming to very specific channels that are relevant, that only relevant people read. So if you have a channel of that payments team, this is the only channel that should receive that alert. Don't have a general operation channel or DevOps channel that receives a bunch of different alerts. But if the payment system is receiving an alert on a failed payment over $100 in the US, like we described, someone's going to take care of that. Now you can add description to alerts these days, so you can actually have an explanation saying this means that a user over $100 is failing to purchase. Here's a link to the runbook and so on. And that's just one example on how alerting on logs can get you to react faster to issues and also resolve them faster, because the user receiving that alert has much more context and is also more relevant to handling that issue. The different types of alerts. So there are a few types. I'll talk about the three main ones and a bonus one I'd say that Coralogix offers. So there's the immediate alert. You'd probably used it in the past. Immediate alerts are set for critical events that you must be notified immediately on. So usually critical and fatal logs. And the minute it happens, you want to receive an alert to your email, Slack, pager, and so on, and get down to it. That's the simple use case. More than alert, meaning alerts that are sending you a notification when something happens more than a certain number that you predefine, are usually there to identify issues that are starting to occur in your system. For instance, if 1 out of 1,000 people is failing to pay or purchase in your app, that's something that you can live with, but you want to see an alert that is triggering whenever the amount of users failing to pay is over 10 in the past hour. So these types of alerts are also very trivial, and if they're properly defined and sent to the right channel, then people know exactly what happened and why they are receiving that alert. And more than that, what is it that they should look at within the logs to solve it faster? Another type of alert is what we call less than alert. These are, I think, the most proactive alerts that you can get generally in your monitoring stack, because these are alerts that send you a notification whenever something's happening, or I'm sorry, something is not happening, not something happening. So, for example, if you have a database table cleanup happening every day, you want to receive an alert that cleanup didn't happen today. Now, database cleanups that don't happen usually don't cause anything until they do. So when the database size explodes, now you have a huge issue. But if you receive that alert the first day that the cleanup didn't happen, you can actually be proactive to the extent of putting this on your calendar for tomorrow and handling it way before anyone notices or any other metric is going wild. So if you think about, your database size or CPU or memory or anything else, you see a tiny increase when the cleanup isn't happening, but you're going to need like 3, 4, 5 weeks until everything explodes. While a less than alert can tell you exactly what happened, exactly the missing log, within the same day or hour, or depending on the interval of time that you want to be alerted on. So these are all great alerts that you can get from logs, and all, when properly defined and set to the right destination, can make you way more proactive than relying on other tools. And then there are a couple alerts that we add in Coralogix that I think they're adding even more color when you receive them. One of them is what we call dynamic alert, when we basically set a dynamic threshold for your criteria. So you build that query, and we set a dynamic threshold for the different hours of the day and different days of the week. And another alert is what we call ratio alert, that allows you to alert on the ratio between different queries. So if I'm okay with 1% of failed payments, I can define 2 queries. The first query is saying user failed to purchase. The second one is saying user purchased successfully. And I can ask Coralogix to notify me if the ratio is over 1%. So only if over 1% of my users are failing, I'm going to receive that alert. Creating the right structure for alert handling, that goes back to my example in Slack. Build an area in Slack that is all dedicated to your logging, matrix, tracing alerts. And that area should have different teams based on their functions, their skills. It should have a separate on-call rotation team. It should have a general operations team where people can brainstorm whenever there's an issue. But every team receiving an alert knows, everyone in that team, everyone in that channel should know that if they receive that alert, considering that the severity was done properly, that the alert was defined properly, that the channel has only relevant people, they need to stop and look at that alert. and then they know who to ask if they need further assistance. They know the different rooms that have, communicating microservices maybe that might be involved in that incident. They can actually look at the logs. If they've written the right logs based on this presentation, they can actually know exactly which service had an issue in the communication between them, and then add that team to the loop. And they can always consult with the rest of the team in the general operations team. So when you do that and not just bombard one channel with a bunch of alerts, you can first of all avoid alert fatigue, but most of all, you can avoid missing important events that affect your production and are generally more probable to be found by logs before any other tool. And now the last thing is to push or not to push. This is some sort of a question that you need to ask yourself when you define an alert. So do you push that alert to PagerDuty or even email or Slack or SMS? The one question that you need to ask yourself is just to simulate yourself getting that exact alert at 2, 3 a.m. and waking up. If the answer to how do you react is, slam your phone, go back to sleep, never define this alert. No one cares, and it shouldn't be an alert. It might be a report, it might be a dashboard that people look at, but obviously, if you had received that alert in the middle of the night, you'd probably ignore it. If your reaction is to say, that is interesting, I have to look at this tomorrow, define the alert, but don't push it. Just define that alert, or have it on your dashboard. When you log in, just go through the alerts and understand if anything unusual happened. If your reaction is to stop everything, get out of bed, wash your face, and start working, this is the only scenario where you actually push that alert to PagerDuty or as a text message or a Slack. So the only consideration that you need to have is, how would I react receiving that in the middle of the night? And that'll give you the answer whether you want to push this to your on-call rotation or not. A bit about logging to enhance your CI/CD. So with many CI/CD tools out there, one of the best ones is Codefresh. You're able today to do a lot more deployments and have better control over them. It's smooth, it's fast, and this market, it just keeps moving forward. Now, we're getting to that point where we want to actually optimize. So by getting the build logs in, the build statistics in, we're actually able now to search and visualize errors during our build, timing of the build. We can understand if we have load issues. Let's see if the builds took longer based on the amount of builds that we've actually performed. Maybe we have a scale issue. Let's see how we react faster. And there's a very big, there's big importance to how fast you can deploy to production, because when you just do a standard deployment, it doesn't mean enough. It doesn't mean anything. If it took you 30, 40, 50 minutes, that's okay. You've done your version, you deploy. But if you're in the middle of a crisis and you want to roll, and that's one of the most important things in CI/CD, or the reasons for CI/CD, if you're in a crisis and you want to roll a new version to production fast, you don't want to wait 30 minutes, 40 minutes. So by having the logs in and optimizing the logs, the timing, the testing that you do, you can actually achieve a lot more, do faster CI/CD, and get better results. And then you want to benchmark the versions, and that's something that you get with Coralogix. So Coralogix basically integrates to any CI/CD tool, and then allows you to get a tag on every version that you upload to production. That tag is represented in Coralogix just like you see here in this picture. For instance, this is an integration with Codefresh. Whenever you deploy, you see that tag, and then Coralogix uses its learning throughout all the time that you've been sending data to give you a benchmark of whatever happened in that version. So for instance, we deployed 20 hours ago for this environment, and we see that ever since we have no alerts, we have 4 anomalies that we can drill down into. High severity logs ratio rose a little, which is always something interesting. Here are the top errors that you have in your version. Here are suspected errors. These are errors that happen more because of your upgrade. This is always interesting. You've deployed, and then 20 hours later, there are some critical logs and error logs that used to happen very rarely and suddenly happen. And here are newly introduced logs, which is the most powerful part. These are logs, in this case, filtered to errors that never happened before this version. So these are brand new. They came with your deployment, and you definitely want to look into them. So by integrating your CI/CD, you achieve faster delivery, better control over your builds and scaling of your CI/CD process, and you get benchmarks on any version. And more than that, these tags are now presented whenever you search your logs. You can also query your data by a tag. So you can basically ask Coralogix, give me all the latest logs from this particular version in production. So that gives you easier search, more collaboration in your team, automatic benchmarks, and better CI/CD process. So this is how we basically utilize the best source of truth that you have in your organization, which is your log data, to improve the most critical part of your R&D productivity, which is the CI/CD process. A bit about how you can use logs to generate smart matrix. Logs, unlike matrix, are tagged in essence. It's tagged data, it's labeled data. When you use logs the right way, and you, again, add the right metadata, combine numeric and textual data, build logs that are relevant for more than just the engineering department, you can generate business logic matrix. I'm not talking about infrastructure monitoring. I'm talking about number of errors per purchase, number of active users in your system. How does the performance and latency in your web server affect how much time people spend on your website? Everything that is combining between the operations and your business can be now visualized from your logs because the data is already there. And so, for instance, you can already do that today in Kibana. Basically, take your log data and visualize it and put it on a graph. The problem is that it's super expensive, and if you want to do this long term, you're going to have some performance issues. We've added a tool called Logs to Matrix in Coralogix. It basically allows you to create a query, define the aggregation, define the labeling, and store that for a full year with Coralogix, regardless of your account retention, and then visualize long-term trends of labeled data. And also, you don't need to go back to your code to add those hooks to generate those matrix. You just generate them from your logs. So now all you need to take care of is write good logs. You write good logs and everything follows. You get your matrix, you get your CI/CD accelerated, you get your version benchmarks, and obviously you get faster alerts that have more context and allow you to be more proactive in production. One last thing is why are logs called logs? So it's an interesting story about how you measure the speed of boats. I don't know if many of you given it a thought, but you measure the speed of a boat in a unit of measure called knots. And the reason it's called that way is that hundreds of years ago, when they wanted to measure the speed of a boat, they basically tie a log, they take a log, they tie it to a rope, and they make knots every 10 meters or so. And then they just throw it in the water and count the amount of knots that went through their hands within a certain period of time. And then what they do, they write it in a note that basically says, we sailed north at a speed of 20 knots for half an hour. And then we sailed east 20 minutes in a speed of 5 knots. And when you're in the middle of the ocean, you can't really know where you're located. So the best way for you to understand where you are is to open that log book, that log note, and read all the directions that you've been sailing to and the speeds, and then understand exactly where you're located and where you go next. So this is the first log document, the first log file, and that's why we called logs logs today. So that's it for our presentation, and now for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And I wanted to give Byron a chance to come on first and let everyone know about a great offer that you have from Coralogix.
Awesome. Thank you, Taryn. First of all, I want to thank everyone on behalf of Coralogix and Codefresh for your participation in this presentation and demonstration. As a kind of a reward for your attendance, Coralogix and Codefresh want to provide you with 15 hours of continued education from one of Udemy's top instructors, Frank Kane. To facilitate that, shortly you'll receive an email with a coupon code for not only this offer, but an offer to try Coralogix as well as Codefresh. And as you know, if you have any questions at all or wish to have a private conversation with either of us, please obviously don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Taryn.
Yeah, I see a question here, by the way, about a live demo. So we can actually make a quick one just to show you what it is that Coralogix does differently. So I want to focus in the interesting parts. One of them is the log screen in Coralogix. It allows you an interesting way of looking at data that we call log aggregation. So many times you find yourselves looking for an error, for instance, and then you get a bunch of logs. You get hundreds of logs or thousands of logs, and now you need to analyze them. Let's take 6 hours of errors. There are 10,000 logs happening here. We see a spike right here, but we don't know much. Log aggregation happens automatically to all your logs and clusters these logs into templates. So now we see that these are 45%, should happen 4,400 times. We see the different parameters. We can quickly visualize them just by clicking on a parameter. And now Coralogix brings the distribution of that data. It doesn't matter, by the way, if it's JSON formatted or unstructured. We can click the occurrences and let Coralogix explain how this log behaved and what's its normal behavior. And then it's very easy to zoom into a log that we want to get further context to, regardless of its variables, and then query around a particular log to understand what happened prior and after that event. And then whenever you want to define an alert, you can just click create an alert and add ratio alerts, notify immediate, more or less, or more than usual alerts. Anomalies that we detect, if we go to the inside screen, are the two main ones are flow anomalies, where we discover sequences of logs that arrive together at a certain time frame, ratio, and order, and then notify on a missing log, basically understanding sequences that happen across microservices, and then point out suspected errors, top errors, and newly introduced logs and errors that happen during that flow breakage, and volume anomalies that detect spikes, traffic spikes, error spikes, bad API response spikes. So a lot of the times users miss out on these events where the ratio of errors suddenly spike from 0.3 to 4.45, 16 times over the usual, but users fail to see that because things go back to normal. During that time, there's a crisis happening, but a lot of times we only see the lagging indicators again, whether it's performance or matrix or complaining users. Coralogix also points out suspected errors from that time frame, top errors, and newly introduced errors. And then we tie up everything to the versions. So whenever you deploy a version, all you need to do is go to the Coralogix tags view, click that version, and get a full benchmark of whatever happened ever since you deployed. And everything here is built on technologies that you're all familiar with. So you can use the Elastic API or Kibana or even plug in Grafana to generate matrix and logs in Coralogix, enrich them, and then present them in other tools or use APIs to build on top of them. So that's just to give you guys a very quick brief of how we see logs and how we do logging differently.
Thanks, Ariel. And I want to answer, we have a few questions in the chat, but we have one in the Q&A that came in first. So I want to get this answered for John. He says they have comprehensive logging at several levels, platform, services, and applications, and alerting enabled. But recently they saw a 20 times spike in traffic within a very short time, less than 60 seconds. Their logging was overwhelmed and alerts cascaded out of control. How would you handle this use case? He says they already get about 1 billion with a B log messages a day.
Yes. So basically, one of the smarter things that we've done here is that we've created alerts that are dynamic or ratio based. So there are a few levels actually to handle that. One is that whenever the traffic started to spike, you'd get a volume anomaly notifying you about it. Maybe you need to switch off logging, maybe something changed. Coralogix also allows block rules that allow you to define a block rule that blocks traffic that you don't want to pay for and you don't want to ingest it based on service name or application or severity or even regular expression. Second of all, you have dynamic alerts and ratio alerts that don't go off whenever the traffic spikes because they're based on dynamic models or on ratios. So it doesn't matter the size of traffic. If I'm relying on ratio or on seasonal models, I should be able to not generate too many alerts. And then another way to answer that is flow anomalies that are looking at sequences of logs, and then it doesn't matter how many times that sequence arrived, we only alert on the breakage of that sequence. So if you have a traffic spike, you can prevent that. You're going to be notified about it. Our alerts are not going to go off, and our automatic anomalies are going to detect it. So I guess that answers the question.
Thank you. And then I see another question in the chat. How is this different from Grafana?
Grafana is mostly built for matrix data. It doesn't have any of the capabilities that I mentioned about version benchmarks, anomaly detection, dynamic threshold alerts, ratio alerts. Grafana is not a great tool to display text. Logkey is very preliminary. It's not a tool where you can actually slice the data. Tools like log aggregation are obviously missing their normal behavior of logs and so on and so forth. But we do plug into Grafana. So if you want to plug your Grafana instance to Coralogix, Coralogix becomes a data source to your Grafana. So you can even generate matrix from your logs within Coralogix and decide their granularity and their labeling, and then present them in your Grafana to enrich and power your matrix collection sources.
Sounds good. And if anyone has any more questions, please feel free and enter them into the chat. For just a moment, I'm going to launch a poll. Thank you so much for your feedback on this webinar, and we will continue with a couple questions. Let's see, Newton would like to know if there is a free trial available of Coralogix, and if so, how?
So there is a free trial, 14 days. It's pretty extensive. And also Coralogix offers a free tier up to 1 gigabyte a month forever. So if you have a small project that you're running, it's pretty easy to set up. We have 24/7 support that'll help you both connecting your logs and with product questions. So yeah, you can trial this. You can use this for your own projects, and then you only scale when you need it.
Excellent. I was going to say that's the last question, but one just popped up. What kind of agents need to be installed?
We integrate with basically, there are about 50 different integrations. So the classic ones are FluentD, FileBeat, Logstash that read from files. These are plugins that we've created to well-known, respected, and trusted open source collectors so that you don't need to add any agent to your server from a company that you're not well familiar with. Also, we integrate with syslog. We have a bunch of different SDKs. We integrate with platforms like Heroku or Akamai. And we also have built-in integrations for Kubernetes clusters or all the AWS services. So any AWS services that you're using, CloudWatch, S3, VPC Flow, CloudTrail, ECS, it's just a plug and play type of integration where everything comes formatted directly to Coralogix.
Awesome. And I want to remind everyone to look out for a follow-up webinar because we will be developing an official integration into Codefresh using with Coralogix. So look out for that upcoming webinar and that official step in our steps marketplace. And that looks like all the questions for today. So thank you very much, Ariel, and to the whole Coralogix team for this great presentation. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
you.